A powerful tech CEO, Jonathan Blake, finds himself isolated and unfulfilled despite his massive success. When a chance encounter with a struggling single father and his two young sons opens his eyes to the consequences of corporate greed, Jonathan embarks on a journey to redefine his life's purpose. The sun was setting over San Francisco, casting long shadows across the city streets. Jonathan Blake, CEO of one of the largest tech empires in the world, walked aimlessly through the bustling streets. His usual entourage of assistants and security wasn't with him today. He had dismissed them, wanting to be alone. Yet, as he passed by the busy cafes and trendy shops, the weight of his isolation pressed heavily on his chest. Despite his immense success, the towering buildings of his company, and the billions in his bank account, Jonathan felt utterly alone. Jonathan wasn't always this way. In his younger years, he had been driven, passionate, and surrounded by people who admired him. Now, at 46, his life had become a monotonous cycle of board meetings, investment deals, and endless emails. The parties, the applause, the media, all of it had become hollow, a shallow echo of a life that once held meaning. As he walked, his thoughts drifted to the root of his loneliness. His relationships had all withered over time. Family, friends, even his marriage. His wife, Christine, had left him 2 years ago, tired of living in a house that felt more like a corporate office than a home. She had begged him to change, to step away from the relentless pursuit of more wealth and power. But he hadn't listened. By the time he realized the cost of his obsession, it was too late. She was gone, and he hadn't spoken to her since the divorce. Jonathan stopped in front of a small cafe, its warm glow and soft chatter calling to him. Through the window, he saw people gathered in intimate groups, laughing and sharing moments that he had long forgotten how to cherish. On a whim, he stepped inside, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and pastries enveloping him. He chose a corner table, far from the noise, where he could observe the people around him. There was a pang of envy as he watched a couple in their 20s sharing a dessert, whispering and smiling at each other as if no one else existed. How long had it been since he felt that kind of connection? As he sipped his coffee, his eyes drifted to a man sitting a few tables away. He was alone, too, but unlike Jonathan, his attention was focused on two young boys seated with him. The boys were loud, energetic, and clearly trying the man's patience as they bickered over a toy. The man, tired, his hair disheveled, was doing his best to keep them under control while trying to sip his coffee in peace. Jonathan noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the weariness in his every movement. At one point, the man looked up, meeting Jonathan's gaze for a brief second. Jonathan quickly looked away, feeling a strange sense of guilt for watching. But the scene tugged at something deep inside him, something long buried beneath years of ambition and detachment. Jonathan had never had children of his own, never took the time to even think about it seriously. He had always told himself that there would be time later, after he had secured his empire. But now, seeing this man struggling to manage his two kids, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a strange, unfamiliar sense of longing. The man's exasperated sigh broke Jonathan's thoughts. One of the boys had knocked over a glass of water, and the other was now crying, clutching his father's sleeve. The man, clearly overwhelmed, tried to calm them both, his voice low but strained. It was a scene Jonathan had never experienced firsthand, chaotic and messy, but there was something deeply human about it, something that felt real. Without thinking, Jonathan stood up. His feet carried him to the man's table before his mind could stop him. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. The man looked up, startled, his face flushed with embarrassment. No, it's okay." "Really?" he stammered, trying to juggle the crying boy and clean the mess at the same time. Jonathan, undeterred, grabbed a few napkins from the nearby counter and began to help wipe up the spilled water. "It's no trouble. I've got time," he said, not quite sure why he was offering, but feeling compelled to stay. The man looked at him, this time more carefully. "Thanks," he muttered, still unsure of what to make of the stranger who had appeared at his table. The boys, momentarily distracted by Jonathan's presence, quieted down, eyeing him curiously. Jonathan crouched down, handing the napkins to one of the boys. "Here, you can help too," he said gently. The boy hesitated but took the napkins, starting to mop up the mess with Jonathan's guidance. The man sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's been a rough day," he admitted, almost to himself. "I'm Greg, by the way, and these two troublemakers are Ben and Oliver." Jonathan smiled slightly. "Jonathan," he said, extending his hand. Greg shook it, though he still seemed a little confused by Jonathan's sudden appearance. "Thanks again. I don't usually get much help with, well, anything, really," Greg said, his voice trailing off with a weary chuckle. Jonathan sat down, feeling something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what had drawn him to this man's table, but for the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't thinking about his company, his wealth, or his status. He was thinking about this small, messy moment in a cafe, something so far removed from the cold, calculated world he lived in. Maybe, Jonathan thought, this was the connection he had been missing all along. Jonathan didn't know why he stayed. He had never been the type to get involved in the lives of strangers, much less in a situation like this. But something about Greg and his two boys held him there, like gravity pulling him towards something he couldn't yet understand. As they finished cleaning up the spilled water, Greg finally let out a tired laugh. "I swear, it's always like this," he said, shaking his head. "Ben knocks something over, Oliver cries, and I'm just stuck in the middle." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, clearly exhausted. "Sorry if we're disturbing you. It's been a long day." Jonathan waved off the apology. "Not at all. I was just passing through," he said, though it felt like a lie. The truth was, he had nowhere else to be. The empty penthouse apartment waiting for him seemed like the last place he wanted to return to. The boys, now a little calmer, were playing quietly with their toy cars on the table, the earlier chaos fading into the background. Jonathan found himself studying Greg more closely. His clothes were worn but clean, and there was a certain roughness to him, a man who had been through more than his fair share of struggles. Yet, despite everything, there was a quiet resilience in Greg's demeanor, a strength Jonathan couldn't quite place. "You've got your hands full," Jonathan remarked, nodding toward the boys. Greg let out a small, humorless laugh. "You could say that. It's just me in them now." His voice softened, and he looked away for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "My wife passed away last year. Cancer. It was fast." He paused, clearly not wanting to dwell on the details. Since then, it's been a bit of a struggle trying to balance everything: work, the kids' life. Jonathan felt an unexpected pang in his chest. He had faced challenges in his life, but nothing like this. His problems, though they often felt overwhelming, paled in comparison to the raw reality Greg was living. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said quietly. Greg nodded, his expression tightening for a moment before he pushed it aside. "Thanks. It's just, life moves on, you know? I have to keep going, for their sake. But some days, I'm not sure how much longer I can keep all the plates spinning." He glanced at the boys, who were now deeply engrossed in their game. "They're my whole world, though. I'd do anything for them." Jonathan was silent for a moment, processing what Greg had just shared. The man in front of him was not just struggling. He was fighting to hold his life together. It was a fight Jonathan couldn't fully comprehend, but he felt an undeniable respect for Greg's perseverance. "What do you do for work?" Jonathan asked, curious. Greg hesitated. "I'm a mechanic." "Well, I was," he corrected himself. "I've been taking odd jobs here and there since everything happened. It's been tough keeping up with everything. Rent, bills, the boys' school. Some days, it feels like I'm barely keeping my head above water." Jonathan didn't miss the weight behind those words. He had never known financial struggle in the same way. His world was one of excess, of decisions made in boardrooms with millions of dollars on the line. But for Greg, the stakes were different. Every day was a battle just to survive, to keep his family afloat. "I don't mean to pry," Jonathan said cautiously, "but is there any way I could help?" Greg blinked, clearly taken aback by the offer. He looked at Jonathan, really looked at him for the first time, as if trying to figure out why this well-dressed stranger was suddenly interested in his life. "Help? Greg repeated, almost disbelieving. Jonathan nodded. Yeah, I mean, I have the resources. If there's anything I can do to make things easier for you, I'd be happy to. It was an impulsive offer, one he wasn't entirely sure he knew how to follow through on. But something inside him, a long-buried instinct, perhaps, was urging him to act. Greg stared at him, his expression a mix of confusion and hesitation. That's really generous of you, but I don't even know you. There was a nervous laugh in his voice, as if he were trying to make sense of the situation. I mean, who just walks up and offers to help a stranger like that? Jonathan understood the skepticism. It wasn't something he had ever done before. But then again, he had never felt so disconnected from everything in his own life, either. I guess I just feel like I can do something. And maybe I should. Greg was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting between Jonathan and his boys. I don't know, he finally said, his voice heavy with reluctance. I appreciate it, really, but I don't want to be a burden. Jonathan shook his head. You're not a burden. You're a father doing everything you can for your kids. That's not something you should have to do alone. There was another pause as Greg wrestled with his thoughts. Finally, he sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. All right, he said slowly, but I don't want charity. If you really want to help, maybe, I don't know, maybe you could put in a good word for me somewhere? I could use a more steady job. Jonathan's mind raced. He could easily do that, connect Greg with some of his contacts, find him a decent job, but somehow, that didn't feel like enough. I can do that, he said, but I was thinking, maybe something more. Maybe I can help with the boys too. Greg raised an eyebrow. Help with the boys? Jonathan nodded, a small smile forming. Yeah, I don't have much experience with kids, but maybe I could help out now and then. You know, take some of the weight off your shoulders. Greg seemed genuinely stunned by the offer. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Finally, he just nodded, his expression softening. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Jonathan said quietly. Let's just start with this. I'll see what I can do about a job, and we'll figure out the rest. Greg exhaled, some of the tension easing from his face. That sounds good. Thank you. Jonathan nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief settle over him. As he glanced at the boys, now playing quietly, he realized that this moment, this small connection, felt more meaningful than anything he had done in years. And for the first time in a long while, Jonathan Blake felt like he had a purpose beyond the walls of his office in the world of business. As they exchanged numbers, Jonathan couldn't help but think that this encounter was more than just a coincidence. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something that could finally fill the void that had been growing inside him for so long. A few weeks had passed since Jonathan had crossed paths with Greg and his two boys. During that time, Jonathan had made good on his promise. He had reached out to his network and helped Greg land a stable job as a mechanic at a local auto shop, a position that paid better and gave him the flexibility he needed to care for Ben and Oliver. The relief in Greg's voice when he thanked Jonathan was palpable, and for the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. Despite their vastly different lives, Jonathan had begun visiting Greg and the boys more regularly. Their interactions started casually, Jonathan bringing small gifts for the kids or stopping by to check in on how Greg was adjusting to the new job. But over time, the bond between them deepened. Jonathan found himself spending more time with the boys, learning how to entertain them, even teaching them small things like how to tie their shoes or helping them with their homework. It was a new experience for him, one that he found unexpectedly fulfilling. One rainy afternoon, as Jonathan sat in Greg's small living room watching Ben and Oliver play with toy cars, Greg returned from work, looking more worn out than usual. His face was tense, and there was an unmistakable worry in his eyes. Jonathan noticed immediately. Rough day? He asked, trying to keep his tone light. Greg nodded, dropping into a chair with a heavy sigh. Yeah, it's been a lot lately. More than I can handle, to be honest. Jonathan leaned forward. What's going on? Greg hesitated, his fingers rubbing his temples. It's the house, he admitted. I've been getting letters from the bank and lawyers. Looks like I'm about to lose it. Jonathan frowned. Lose it? What do you mean? Greg sighed deeply, the weight of his struggles clearly pressing down on him. It's complicated. When my wife passed away, we had just refinanced the mortgage. With all the medical bills and me being out of work for a while, I fell behind on payments. I've been trying to catch up, but it's not enough. The bank is foreclosing, and I don't think there's anything I can do about it. Jonathan felt a pit form in his stomach. The small, modest house Greg lived in wasn't much, but it was home. He could see how much it meant to Greg and his boys. They had already lost so much. Losing their home would devastate them. Have you tried talking to the bank? Maybe there's a way to work out a deal, Jonathan suggested, though he already knew the answer. Greg shook his head. I've tried everything. I even got a lawyer, but it's no use. The foreclosure process is already moving, and I can't afford to fight it. Jonathan sat back, his mind racing. He couldn't let this happen, not after everything Greg had been through. Do you know who's handling the foreclosure? Greg looked up, clearly surprised by Jonathan's intense interest. Yeah, it's some real estate development firm. Hartman Properties, I think. They're notorious for buying up foreclosed homes and flipping them for a profit. I've heard stories about how ruthless they are. The name hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. Hartman Properties. It was all too familiar to him, because it was one of the companies his firm had been doing business with for years. Hartman was a major player in the real estate market, known for their aggressive tactics and underhanded deals. Jonathan had signed off on a partnership with them long ago, back when his focus had been solely on growing his empire. He hadn't bothered to look closely at their practices, trusting his team to handle the details. But now, hearing Greg's story, Jonathan felt a wave of shame wash over him. His company had profited from deals with people like Hartman, without a second thought about who got hurt in the process. And now, Greg, his friend, was on the verge of losing his home because of the very business Jonathan had been complicit in. I know them, Jonathan said quietly, his mind reeling. Hartman Properties, they're connected to my company. Greg's eyes widened in shock. What? You mean you're involved with them? Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening. I didn't realize. Not until now. But we've done business with them. A lot of business, actually. Greg looked stunned. So, you're part of this? Jonathan felt a surge of guilt. Not directly. I didn't know about your situation, but, yeah, I've been involved in deals with them. And from what I'm hearing now, I should have looked closer at what they were doing. For a moment, there was a tense silence between them. Jonathan could see the conflict in Greg's eyes. The disbelief that someone who had helped him could also be connected to the company trying to take his home. Look, Jonathan said, breaking the silence. I didn't know, but now that I do, I can fix this. I'll talk to Hartman. I'll make sure they back off. Greg stared at him, skepticism etched across his face. I appreciate what you've done for me, Jonathan. But this is huge. How can you stop it? Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady and determined. I have leverage. A lot of it. And trust me, when I say I'll fix this, I mean it. They're not going to take your home. Greg's expression softened slightly, but the doubt remained. I don't know, man. They're not the kind of people who just walk away from a deal. Jonathan nodded. I know, but I'm not just anyone to them. I'm a major partner. And if they think they can get away with this, they're wrong. Greg seemed to relax a little, but Jonathan could see how much the situation weighed on him. I don't want to drag you into my problems, Greg said after a moment. You've already done so much. Jonathan shook his head. This isn't just your problem anymore. It's mine too. I'll talk to them. You focus on taking care of your boys. Greg hesitated, then nodded. Okay, he said quietly. If you can stop this, I don't even know how to thank you. You don't have to thank me, Jonathan said, standing up. Just let me handle it. That evening, back in the cold, sterile silence of his penthouse, Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about what Greg had told him. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Not just at Hartman Properties, but at himself. For years, he had turned a blind eye to the shady practices of his business partners, caring only about the bottom line. And now, it was coming back to haunt him. He pulled out his phone and made a call to his legal team. I need all the files we have on Hartman Properties, he said, his voice sharp and unyielding. Every deal we've ever done with them. Send it to me by tomorrow morning." He hung up, pacing the room. As much as he hated to admit it, he knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. Hartman wasn't just any partner. They were one of the most powerful players in the real estate game. But Jonathan didn't care. He was done turning a blind eye. He would use every resource at his disposal to stop them from taking Greg's home. And if that meant burning bridges with a longtime partner, so be it. Jonathan stared out at the city skyline, the lights of San Francisco twinkling below. For the first time in a long while, he felt a fire burning inside him. One that wasn't about money or power. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. This time, he wouldn't just stand by and watch. He was going to fight, and he wasn't going to lose. Jonathan didn't sleep much that night. His mind raced, consumed by thoughts of Greg and the looming foreclosure. By the time dawn broke over the San Francisco skyline, he had a plan. The documents his legal team had sent him late into the night confirmed his suspicions. Hartman Properties was exploiting a loophole, targeting vulnerable homeowners like Greg and snapping up their properties for pennies on the dollar. Jonathan's signature, his authority, had paved the way for this. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. Hartman Properties was ruthless, and they wouldn't give up a valuable asset without a struggle. But Jonathan was determined. He couldn't let Greg lose his home, not after all the man had been through. The next morning, Jonathan dressed quickly, forgoing his usual tailored suit for something simpler. Today wasn't about boardroom negotiations. It was about making things right. He called his assistant, instructed her to cancel his meetings for the day, and drove himself to the offices of Hartman Properties. As he stepped into the sleek, glass-walled building, Jonathan felt a familiar wave of confidence wash over him. This was his world. Business, deals, leverage. He had built his empire here, in places like this. But today, his motivation was different. Today, he wasn't here for profit. He was here for Greg. The receptionist greeted him with a bright smile. "Mr. Blake, welcome. Mr. Hartman wasn't expecting you today." "He isn't," Jonathan replied, his voice firm but calm. "But I need to speak with him. It's important." A few minutes later, Jonathan was led into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The man behind the desk, Richard Hartman, stood up as Jonathan entered, a broad grin spreading across his face. "Jonathan," Hartman said, extending a hand. "What a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Jonathan didn't smile. He shook Hartman's hand briefly before sitting down. "We need to talk about the foreclosure on 68 Pinewood Avenue." Hartman raised an eyebrow, his smile faltering slightly. "That's one of our properties, yes? What about it?" "It's not one of your properties," Jonathan said, his voice cold. "It belongs to a friend of mine, Greg Miller, a man who's been through hell and back trying to keep his family afloat after his wife passed away. And now, thanks to Hartman Properties, he's about to lose his home." Hartman leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from casual friendliness to wary caution. "Jonathan, you know how the business works. Foreclosures happen. It's unfortunate, but..." "Unfortunate?" Jonathan cut him off, his voice hard. "Greg's not some faceless debtor. He's a father trying to keep his boys in their home. And you, your company, is exploiting a loophole to take that home away from him." Hartman sighed, glancing at the file on his desk. "Look, I get it. But this is just business. There are 100 cases like this across the city. We can't make exceptions for everyone." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You're going to make an exception for this one?" Hartman's eyes narrowed. "Jonathan, I respect you. We've done good business together over the years, but I'm not sure you understand how deep this goes. We're talking about a significant investment. It's not something we can just walk away from." Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes locked on Hartman's. "Then you're going to lose a hell of a lot more than that property. Because if you don't back off, I'll make sure every deal we've ever done together is dragged into the light. Every shady practice, every questionable contract. And I'll make sure it's public. I have the resources to fight you on this, and trust me, you don't want that." For a moment, the room was silent. Hartman studied Jonathan, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he exhaled slowly, the tension between them palpable. "This is personal for you, isn't it?" Hartman asked, his tone softer, more calculating. It is, Jonathan said firmly, and I'm not backing down. Hartman drummed his fingers on the desk, clearly unhappy but realizing he had little choice. All right, he said finally. I'll pull the foreclosure. The property's yours. Jonathan didn't relax. He knew this was just the first step. And I want Greg's mortgage refinanced at a reasonable rate. No more loopholes, no more tricks. Hartman frowned. That's asking a lot, Jonathan. It's the bare minimum, Jonathan shot back. Make it happen. After a long pause, Hartman nodded slowly. Fine. I'll have the paperwork drawn up, but this is a one-time deal. Don't expect me to start offering handouts to everyone. I don't, Jonathan said, standing up. But you should start rethinking how you do business, Richard. Because if this is how you operate, you won't last long. By the time Jonathan left the office, a sense of grim satisfaction settled over him. It wasn't over yet. There would still be paperwork to sign, contracts to negotiate, but Greg's home was safe, at least for now. Jonathan had done what he set out to do. He had fought for Greg, and he had won. But as he drove back to Greg's neighborhood, a new thought occurred to him. For years, Jonathan had been laser-focused on profit and power. He had built a company that dominated the tech world, secured deals that most CEOs could only dream of. But now, for the first time, he realized that none of it had brought him the satisfaction he felt today. Helping Greg had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about saving a house. It was about making a real difference in someone's life. And for the first time, Jonathan felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. When he arrived at Greg's house, the boys were playing in the front yard, their laughter ringing out across the quiet street. Greg was sitting on the porch, looking tired but more at ease than Jonathan had seen him in a while. Jonathan walked up the steps, and Greg greeted him with a cautious smile. "How'd it go?" he asked, his voice tentative. "It's done," Jonathan said simply. "Hartman's pulling the foreclosure. You're going to get a new mortgage with fair terms." For a moment, Greg just stared at him, disbelief flashing across his face. "Are you serious?" Jonathan nodded. "Yeah, it's not going to be easy, but the house is yours. You're not losing it." Greg stood up, his expression a mix of shock and overwhelming gratitude. He looked like he wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, he pulled Jonathan into a tight hug, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Thank you. I don't even know how to thank you." Jonathan patted Greg's back, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad I could help." Greg stepped back, wiping his eyes, and glanced at the boys, who were now running toward them. "You saved our home," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to us." Jonathan smiled softly as the boys came crashing into their father's arms. "Actually," he said, watching the scene, "I think I do." As the sun began to set, Jonathan stayed a while longer, helping Greg with the boys and listening to their excited chatter about school and friends. It was a simple, chaotic evening, full of laughter and small moments of joy. And for the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he belonged. As he drove home that night, the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long seemed lighter. His life had always been defined by his success, by the empire he had built. But now, he was starting to see that true success wasn't measured by wealth or power. It was measured by the people you helped, the lives you touched. Jonathan wasn't sure where this new path would lead him, but he knew one thing. He had found something worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right side of the battle. Jonathan felt a strange sense of peace as he drove back to his penthouse that night. For once, he had acted not out of business interests or personal gain, but out of genuine concern for someone else. Helping Greg felt like a turning point, a new beginning in a life that had become mired in loneliness and hollow achievements. But even as that peace settled over him, a nagging thought kept surfacing. His fight with Hartman Properties wasn't over yet. There was more beneath the surface, more he had been blind to for far too long. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at his company's headquarters. His sleek office on the top floor, with its panoramic view of San Francisco, felt cold and distant. The pristine glass walls and modern decor seemed more like a cage than a symbol of success. He sat behind his massive desk, but his mind wasn't on the meetings or deals awaiting him. It was on Hartman Properties and what he had just uncovered. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and his assistant entered. "Mr. Blake, your 10 a.m. meeting with the board is about to start," she said. Jonathan nodded. "Cancel it. I need to deal with something else today." His assistant blinked, surprised. "Should I reschedule or just cancel it?" "I'll be in touch," Jonathan said, his tone making it clear that this wasn't up for discussion. Once she left, Jonathan pulled up the files he had received the previous night. He started sifting through the documents again, reading every contract, every deal, every merger between his company and Hartman Properties. The more he read, the more sickened he became. Hartman wasn't just using loopholes to take advantage of homeowners like Greg. They had built an entire empire on deception, manipulating markets, exploiting vulnerable people, and making sure the legal system was always on their side. And Jonathan, whether knowingly or unknowingly, had been a part of it. He had signed off on these deals, trusted his executives to handle the details, and turned a blind eye to what was really happening. But that would end today. Jonathan picked up his phone and dialed his CFO, Daniel, who had been with him since the early days of the company. Daniel had always been his right-hand man, the one who managed the numbers while Jonathan handled the vision. But now, Jonathan wasn't sure if he could trust him anymore. "Daniel, I need you in my office." "Now," Jonathan said. Within minutes, Daniel appeared, his expression calm but cautious. "What's going on, Jonathan? You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," Jonathan replied, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've been reviewing our deals with Hartman Properties." Daniel's face didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Jonathan didn't like. "Hartman? Why the sudden interest? Those deals were years ago." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "Because they're trying to take a friend's home. And I've realized that their entire operation is built on exploiting people like him." Daniel hesitated, glancing at the stack of papers on Jonathan's desk. "Look, Hartman's aggressive, sure, but it's legal. We've been working with them for years. They're profitable, and they've brought us some significant returns." "I don't care about the returns," Jonathan snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. "I care that we've been enabling them to ruin people's lives. Did you know what they were doing? Did you know how dirty these deals were?" Daniel paused for a beat too long, and that was all the confirmation Jonathan needed. His eyes narrowed as he stood up, pacing the room. "You knew. You've known all along." Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Jonathan, this is how the game is played. You can't grow a company like ours without making some hard decisions. You've always trusted me to handle the financials, and I've done what's necessary to keep us profitable." Jonathan stared at him, the betrayal sinking in deeper than he expected. "At what cost, Daniel? What else have you been keeping from me? How many other deals have we made that are built on people suffering?" Daniel's gaze hardened. "You built this company to win, Jonathan. We've made billions because we don't let emotions get in the way of business. You can't start having second thoughts now just because you met some guy with a sob story." Jonathan's blood boiled at Daniel's words. "This isn't just some sob story. This is real. These are people's lives. And if you think I'm going to let this continue, you're dead wrong." Daniel shrugged, his expression cold. "If you want to cut ties with Hartman, fine. But you know what that will mean for the company. We've got contracts, partnerships, and deals tied up with them. You pull out now, and the board will have your head. They won't stand by and watch you throw away our biggest revenue streams." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. He knew Daniel was right. Cutting ties with Hartman would have massive consequences for the company. Stockholders, the board, and even the media would come after him. But Jonathan didn't care anymore. He was done being a pawn in a game he no longer believed in. "This company is mine," Jonathan said, his voice dangerously low. "And I'll do whatever I damn well please. If the board doesn't like it, they can try to take me down. But I'm done with this. Hartman is out. And if I find out you've been hiding anything else from me, you're out too." Daniel's face hardened. "You're making a mistake, Jonathan. A big one." "Maybe," Jonathan replied, "but at least I'll be able to live with myself." The confrontation with Daniel left Jonathan rattled but resolute. He spent the rest of the day working through the mountain of files, pulling apart every deal with Hartman and examining the full extent of their involvement in his company's operations. It was worse than he had thought. Hartman wasn't the only corrupt partner they had been working with. There were others, all using similar tactics, all profiting off the misery of others. Jonathan knew what he had to do. He drafted a statement announcing that his company would sever all ties with Hartman Properties and any other firm engaged in unethical practices. He would restructure the company, refocusing on transparency and ethical business. It would be a long, difficult process, but he was prepared for the fallout. For too long, he had allowed the pursuit of profit to blind him to the real cost of his success. That ended now. Later that evening, as the office emptied and the city lights twinkled outside his window, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, exhausted but determined. His phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Greg. "Greg, hey, just wanted to let you know the bank called. They're refinancing the mortgage. I don't know how to thank you for this. You saved our home, Jonathan. Thank you." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Jonathan, you don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you and the boys are okay." He put the phone down, staring out into the night. Greg had his home, but this battle was far from over. The fight to clean up his company, to make things right, was just beginning. But for the first time in years, Jonathan didn't feel like he was running on autopilot. He had a mission now, a real one, not just for Greg, but for everyone his company had hurt along the way. Jonathan knew he would face resistance from the board, from the media, and from the very people he had once called allies. But he didn't care. He had made his decision. His legacy wasn't going to be defined by the billions he made or the skyscrapers with his name on them. It was going to be defined by the people he helped, and that was worth fighting for. As the weeks passed, Jonathan threw himself into his new mission. He overhauled the company's policies, terminated corrupt partnerships, and began rebuilding his business from the ground up. The board wasn't happy, but Jonathan's resolve was unshakable. His newfound focus on ethics and fairness gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Jonathan felt a clarity he hadn't known before. But just as he thought things were stabilizing, a new challenge emerged. A challenge that would test everything he had worked for. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Weeks passed, and Jonathan's battle to reshape his company intensified. His decision to sever ties with Hartman Properties and other corrupt partners had sent shockwaves through the corporate world. The board was furious, shareholders were on edge, and the media was circling like vultures, hungry for a scandal. Despite the backlash, Jonathan held firm. He had built his empire, and if it had to fall to do what was right, so be it. But as the dust settled and the lawsuits and inquiries began to take shape, Jonathan realized that the fight was far from over. Hartman Properties, enraged by the public fallout from Jonathan's decision, wasn't going down quietly. They threatened legal action, accusing Jonathan of breaching contracts and damaging their reputation. It was the kind of corporate warfare Jonathan had waged successfully for years, but now he found himself on the other side. He wasn't alone in this, though. Greg, who had learned about the full extent of Jonathan's efforts, reached out regularly, offering words of encouragement. The two had grown closer since the foreclosure crisis had been resolved, and Jonathan found himself spending more and more time at Greg's house with Ben and Oliver. The simple joys of helping with homework, listening to their stories, and sharing meals with the family grounded him in a way nothing else had in years. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Jonathan sat at Greg's kitchen table, watching the boys play in the living room. Greg handed him a beer, his face thoughtful. "You look like hell," Greg said, sitting across from him. Jonathan chuckled tiredly, rubbing his temples. "Feels like it. Things are complicated at the office." Greg nodded. "I can't even imagine the pressure you're under. But you've already done more than anyone would have expected. You saved my home, Jonathan. And I know it wasn't just me. You're trying to change things, and that's huge." Jonathan stared at the bottle in his hands. "It doesn't feel like enough. I've hurt so many people over the years without even realizing it. Now that I know what's been happening behind the scenes, I can't just let it go. But the company, it's like fighting a machine." Greg leaned back, his eyes scanning Jonathan's tired face. "So, what's your endgame? What do you really want out of all this?" Jonathan was silent for a moment, the question weighing heavily on him. What did he want? For most of his life, it had been simple. More. More success, more power, more money. But now, sitting in this small kitchen, surrounded by the warmth of a family he had grown to care about, the answer seemed clearer than ever. "I don't want to be the guy who's just chasing the next deal," Jonathan said slowly. "I don't want to be remembered as the CEO who built an empire but left nothing that mattered behind. I want to do something real, something that actually makes a difference." Greg smiled faintly. "Seems like you're already doing that." Jonathan shook his head. "It's not enough to just fix one thing. The company, it's built on the wrong foundations. I can't change what's already been done, but I can change what happens next." Greg nodded, understanding the weight of Jonathan's words. "So, what are you going to do?" Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady with resolve. "I'm going to make sure this company doesn't stand for exploitation anymore. I'll dismantle every corrupt partnership, burn every bridge if I have to. And when it's done, I'll leave it behind." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Leave it behind? You mean, step down?" Jonathan nodded. "Yeah, I built it, but I don't belong there anymore. It's time to let it go." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, decisions, and more than a few battles with the board. Jonathan moved quickly, cutting ties with unethical partners and initiating a restructuring plan that would prioritize ethical business practices over profit. The company's profits took a hit and the stock price wobbled, but Jonathan didn't care. He was prepared to fight for what was right, even if it cost him everything. His decision to step down, however, came as a shock to everyone. The board tried to stop him, offering compromises, deals, and even threats. But Jonathan's mind was made up. He had spent enough time in that world, and it was time to find a new path. On his last day as CEO, Jonathan sat in his office, the city of San Francisco stretching out before him like a vast, glittering kingdom. It no longer felt like his kingdom, though. He had spent years chasing the illusion of power, but now he knew that real power came from something else: connection, purpose, and leaving the world a little better than he had found it. As he packed up his belongings, Jonathan felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down at the screen to see a message from Greg. "Greg, dinner tonight? The boys want to see you." Jonathan smiled. Jonathan wouldn't miss it. That evening, Jonathan arrived at Greg's house just as the sun was setting. The warm, golden light spilled over the small yard where Ben and Oliver were playing, their laughter filling the air. Greg stood on the porch, waving him over with a grin. "Just in time," Greg said as Jonathan approached. "The boys have been asking about you all day." Jonathan smiled, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift slightly. "Glad to be here." As they sat down to dinner, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of contentment. The chaos of his old life seemed far away now, and for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. After dinner, Greg and Jonathan sat outside, watching the boys chase fireflies in the fading light. The conversation turned to the future, Greg's plans for the house, the boys' schools, and Jonathan's next steps. "So, what's next for you?" Greg asked, glancing at Jonathan. "Now that you're not running a tech empire anymore?" Jonathan shrugged, smiling. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe something smaller, something more personal. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, something to help families like yours, people who are struggling to make ends meet." Greg smiled. "That sounds like something you'd be great at." Jonathan looked out at the boys, who were now running up and down the yard, their laughter echoing in the cool evening air. "I think I'd like that," he said softly. "It's time to focus on what really matters." In the months that followed, Jonathan stayed true to his word. He founded a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families facing financial hardship. It wasn't glamorous or high-profile like his old life, but it was meaningful. He poured his energy into the work, helping people find housing, secure jobs, and rebuild their lives. It was the most fulfilling work he had ever done. Greg and his boys became a permanent fixture in Jonathan's life. They shared holidays, birthdays, and countless small moments that reminded Jonathan of the importance of human connection. For years, Jonathan had been surrounded by people, but he had never felt as close to anyone as he did to Greg and his family. His legacy, once defined by towering buildings and billion-dollar deals, was now something different, something more human. Jonathan had redefined success for himself, and in doing so, he had found a new purpose, a new family, and a life that, for the first time, felt truly rich. As he sat in Greg's backyard one evening, watching the boys play, Jonathan realized that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not wealth, not power, but meaning. And it was worth more than anything he had ever built.